The decisions that shaped what children ate in the 1980s and 90s were made decades earlier, in rooms most people never saw, by committees most people never heard of. What arrived on store shelves wasn't the result of consumer demand. It was the result of industrial capacity meeting regulatory approval. And once it was approved, it didn't need to be explained. It just needed to be everywhere. By 1975, the food supply had already begun its transformation. Ingredients that didn't exist in kitchens 50 years prior were now listed on nearly every package. Hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup, artificial colors derived from petroleum, preservatives with names that required a chemistry degree to pronounce. These weren't additions made in secrecy. They were authorized, tested under the standards of the time, and introduced gradually enough that each new ingredient felt like a minor adjustment rather than a fundamental change. The process was methodical. A new additive would be reviewed by regulatory agencies, often based on studies funded by the manufacturers themselves. If the acute toxicity tests came back clean, meaning the substance didn't immediately harm lab animals, it was granted generally recognized as safe status, GRAS. That designation didn't require long-term studies. It didn't require analysis of cumulative exposure. It simply meant that within the scope of testing available at the time, nothing alarming had appeared. And so the ingredients were approved, one by one, year after year. Each addition seemed incremental. Each was presented as progress. Shelf stability improved, production costs dropped, distribution networks expanded. The food system became more efficient, more profitable, more centralized. What had once been regional and seasonal became uniform and permanent. Most people didn't question it. There was no reason to. The products were sold in trusted stores. They were advertised during family television programming. They featured cartoon mascots and bright packaging and promises of nutrition. They were endorsed, implicitly, by the fact that they were legal. If something was harmful, the assumption went, it wouldn't be allowed. And if it was allowed, it must be safe. This wasn't discussed openly, not in schools, not in doctors' offices, not in the media coverage of the time. The introduction of novel food chemicals was treated as a technical matter, not a public health concern. It was something that happened in the background, behind the machinery of production and distribution, far removed from the consumer experience. What people saw was the final product. What they didn't see was the decades of incremental decisions that made that product possible. Children born in the 1980s grew up in the first fully industrialized food environment. Every meal, every snack, every drink was shaped by decisions made before they were born. They didn't choose the ingredients, they didn't choose the formulations, they didn't choose the portion sizes or the marketing strategies or the nutritional guidelines that told their parents what to serve. They inherited a system that had already been built, and they adapted to it the way children adapt to anything, by assuming it was normal. And it was normal at the time. Brightly colored cereals with cartoon animals on the box, individually wrapped snacks that could last for months without refrigeration, fruit-flavored drinks that contained no actual fruit. These weren't seen as warning signs, they were seen as conveniences, improvements, proof that science had made life easier. The language used to describe these products reinforced their legitimacy. They were fortified with vitamins, enriched with minerals. The terminology suggested care, precision, optimization. It suggested that someone was paying attention to nutrition, that the products were not just safe, but beneficial. And in some cases, they were. Iron-fortified cereals did reduce anemia rates. Vitamin D in milk did help with bone development. Those were real public health successes, and they lent credibility to the broader transformation of the food supply. But fortification masked something else. It masked the removal, because as ingredients were added, other things were taken away. Whole grains were refined into white flour, stripping away fiber and micronutrients, then enriched with a handful of synthetic vitamins to compensate. Oils were hydrogenated to extend shelf life, creating trans fats that wouldn't be recognized as harmful for another 20 years. The foods were engineered to meet regulatory definitions of adequacy while being fundamentally different from what those regulations were originally designed to protect. The impact wasn't immediate. That's the crucial part. Children who ate these foods didn't collapse. They didn't develop rashes or acute poisoning. They grew, they played, they went to school. Their bodies processed what they were given and adapted as best they could. But adaptation doesn't mean thriving. It means survival within the available parameters. And the parameters had changed. By the time the consequences became visible, they were difficult to attribute. A generation that grew up on convenience foods began experiencing health patterns that previous generations hadn't seen at the same scale. Rising rates of obesity, earlier onset of metabolic disorders, increases in autoimmune conditions and digestive issues. None of these could be traced to a single ingredient or a single meal. They were the result of cumulative exposure, of bodies shaped by an environment that had been chemically altered in ways that were unprecedented in human history. But proving causation is nearly impossible in a system where everything changed at once. Was it the trans fats, the artificial colors, the preservatives, the excess sugar? The answer is likely all of the above, interacting in ways that weren't studied because the regulatory framework didn't require it. Each ingredient was tested in isolation. None were tested in combination. None were tested over a lifetime. The system wasn't designed to account for that. It was designed to allow products to reach the market as efficiently as possible, with the assumption that problems would be identified later, after widespread use. It means that harm has to be demonstrated after the fact, in populations that have already been exposed, rather than prevented before introduction. And so the system chose. It chose scale over caution. It chose efficiency over scrutiny. It chose industrial consistency over biological variability. And it did so on behalf of everyone, without asking permission, because asking permission wasn't part of the process. The food was there. It was affordable. It was convenient. It was what most families could access, and so it became what most families ate. The advertising reinforced the normalcy. Saturday morning cartoons were interrupted every few minutes by commercials for sugary cereals, fruit snacks, soda, fast food. The characters were friendly. The jingles were catchy. The messages were clear. These products were fun, they were tasty, they were part of childhood. They weren't just food, they were culture. But culture is shaped by availability, and availability was shaped by economics. The cheapest calories were the most processed ones. The subsidies went to corn and soy, which became the foundation of industrial food production. These ingredients were cheap because the system made them cheap, and once they were cheap, they were everywhere. That preference didn't develop by accident. It was cultivated. Food scientists understood that certain flavor combinations triggered reward responses in the brain. They understood that fat and sugar together created a signal that the body interpreted as high-value fuel. And they used that understanding to design products that were hyper-palatable, more stimulating to the taste system than anything available in nature. Some people remember when food tasted different. The burden was placed on individuals. Parents were told to make better choices. Children were told to eat their vegetables. But the choices available were shaped by forces far beyond any individual family, by agricultural policy, by subsidy structures, by the fact that ultra-processed foods had become the economic backbone of the American food industry. Changing that system wasn't a matter of personal responsibility. It was a matter of political will. And political will requires public awareness. But public awareness was fragmented, delayed, obscured by conflicting information and the slow pace at which harm becomes undeniable. By the time the data was strong enough to be conclusive, an entire generation had already been raised on these foods. The system didn't intend harm. The engineers and chemists and executives who built this food supply weren't trying to create a public health crisis. They were trying to solve logistical problems. How do you feed a growing population efficiently? How do you reduce costs? Those were the questions they were hired to answer. And they answered them successfully. The food supply became the most efficient in human history. It just wasn't designed for health.